Hello, so this is going to be the second part of the set of 3 Theme 1 lectures that I'll be doing, this time covering Theme 1B, which is essentially the focus of this theme basically looks at the middle period, the interregnum, and the focus is basically, again, the question I put here is why did Republican rule fail to provide a lasting settlement in the years 1649 to 60? In other words, for what reason do Republicans fail to essentially come up with an adequate settlement or solution in their period of 11 years in government? And so, much like the first sub-theme, and of course the next one I'm going to do after this, the theme again is about kind of political instability, but in this particular case, the focus here is on why government or solutions of government fail. And this sub-theme is therefore concerned with the reasons as to why people are unable to find an adequate solution or an adequate lasting settlement after the execution of Charles. Again, as I mentioned in the sort of the summary lecture that I did right at the beginning, throughout the interregnum period, there are various attempts in a very short space of time to basically reform government and end up with a kind of permanent solution, each of which ends up failing for one reason or another. And so if we look at the kind of questions in the specimen papers or past paper material or even in the textbooks, all of the questions that have come up in the past have tended to relate to the reasons why Republican governments fail, or again, that same question of political instability. And so the overarching question you're likely to get here is either why do Republican governments fail with kind of a stated factor, or something about what's the sort of the main causes of political instability. As always, that's kind of the main question or main topic. So just kind of going over the period very quickly again. So you could get a question on the extent of instability, possibly. I mean, I've thought about it. That is a possibility. However, when you think about the actual period, it is really unlikely given how lopsided the situation actually is. If you thought the previous period was unstable, sort of the sort of 25 years of Charles I's rule, the interregnum is even more so. It's clearly an unstable period, with there being at least, and I think you can even go for more than this, but there are at least 4 distinct experiments in government that are kind of made, each of which end up in eventual failure within this very short space of time. So without a shadow of a doubt, this is basically a very unstable period that ends up essentially in failure of government. And so again, if you've kind of watched the revision lecture that I've done on this issue so far, you should be familiar with these. There are at least sort of 4 distinct phases of government during the interregnum period. There's first of all the rump/commonwealth right at the beginning. There is the nominated assembly, also known as the bare bones parliament. You have both the first and second protectorate parliaments, which you could actually separate out as different phases of government, because they're actually quite different. Well, they're different in some ways. And then, of course, you also have the notorious and famous rule of the major generals as well. So you have a variety of different experiments of government that are essentially conducted, each of which end up in failure. As I say, this topic is primarily concerned with why these all kind of end up in failure and why there is kind of an inability to find an adequate solution to this kind of decades-old problem of government. And so when sort of arguing for reasons why there's sort of instability and failure of government, there's essentially 2 ways you could go about structuring this kind of an essay on that topic. One way in which I kind of wouldn't recommend, or which I obviously would recommend. And so the reasons for failure can vary between sort of short-term and long-term problems, either sort of short-term triggers that lead to the collapse of particular governments, or the long-term trends that plague or lead to the general collapse of various different types of governments. And so each government, as I say, has a short-term reason for collapsing. However, I would generally avoid structuring an essay on this topic by looking at each government individually. You might, for example, want to do one particular paragraph about one government alone, if that seemed the only kind of option you had. However, I would in general avoid structuring an essay by sort of doing a paragraph about one type of government and doing sort of 4 paragraphs each, one each about different kinds with a different reason for each failure. You wouldn't necessarily kind of get a bad mark for doing that, but I think generally, if you do things in that way, it limits the kind of analysis you can potentially conduct, because it isn't the most complex. It's not the most sort of sophisticated way of basically explaining the reasons why governments fail. You can potentially do it that way, but I think you're just less likely to get into a level 5. Not even, I'd say, a high 4 is also quite difficult to get into. As I say, you could potentially do one paragraph, maybe even two, that focus on specific governments, why they failed, but you really want to make sure at least one or two of your points are discussing long-term points. And in general, I would argue that the best way of approaching this question would be to discuss the long-term issues that are constantly recurring and affecting different governments. So you want to refer to a long-term problem and then relate that, or rather give evidence from specific governments and why those fail, rather than doing things the other way around. And so in general, I think there are at least sort of 4 to 5 long-term reasons you can give as to why there is political instability and failure. The first of which is basically sort of the nature of parliaments, or you can even say the conservative nature of parliaments, what they're kind of like as a bunch as an institution. Then there is, of course, the role the army plays. And then I've sort of, although it's linked to that, I've also separated from that the role of Cromwell, because I think Cromwell, even though he's kind of linked to the army, plays his own sort of unique, distinct role, and again, arguably has a unique role in kind of causing failure of government. And then there's, of course, similar to the last topic, the role that is played by radical political and religious groups and ideas, and how that contributes to the failure of government. And so you have these sort of 4 distinct reasons and causes. And then the fifth argument you could potentially make is that actually, when you consider the kind of situation of government in this period, that actually failure was inevitable, and that there was never really a kind of a workable, realistic solution to the problems of government in this time period. So going to the first argument, which is the conservative nature of parliaments. So again, I discussed this briefly in the summary video that I made. And when you look at kind of the situation that parliaments face when they basically inherit power, you do really kind of feel quite badly. I mean, you do sort of feel a little bit sorry for them in their situation. As I already mentioned, very little planning actually goes into the establishment of the Commonwealth. It basically all happens in quite a sort of haphazard, rushed way towards the end of sort of 1648 and beginning of 1649 after the execution of Charles. And so kind of from Pride's purge to Charles's execution, etc., very little planning kind of goes into it. And so as a result, power simply passes into the hands of the remaining MPs as a result. So sort of the rump parliament, they basically just inherit power as the remaining institution that could potentially govern. And so what you find though as a result, so initially the kind of group in power are basically the old rump parliament. The problem is though, unlike the army who gave them this power, the rump are not really so concerned with social transformation, and they're instead mainly concerned with, or mainly focused on, ensuring stability and calming conservative fears around the country. So you really need to understand that as a group, as an institution, even though it's basically kind of the old kind of independents who've survived, Parliament still is largely from these sort of like gentry sort of backgrounds, people who, in terms of their kind of main aims, they really are just more interested in maintaining social stability and order at a time where there are quite significant fears across the country by sort of the gentry in the political nation, and there is sort of this lack of stability and this lack of surety that's kind of come about from the execution of Charles, and so Parliament, you find, quickly develops an antagonistic relationship with the army as a result of their sort of conservative outlook and position, as well as Cromwell. And so as a result, you can argue that first of all, the relationship that Parliament develops with the army, as well as their just general cautious and conservative outlook, is what is directly responsible for the failure of several governments. So to kind of illustrate that point with a few examples. So as I say, the fault of their conservative nature can be seen particularly in their early attempts at government. So, for example, if we look at the rump to begin with, so the rump were again, as mentioned in the summary video, were very slow to enact the reforms which the army, who placed them in that position to begin with, were demanding. As I say, the first couple of years there were some reforms, but they slowed down significantly afterwards. Most famously, in particular, they ignored the recommendations of the Hales Commission that were set up to investigate legal reforms, because the argument was that some of their recommendations were a little bit too radical. Such radical ideas at the time, like abolishing the death penalty in certain instances or making it less common. Reform and the rate of it slows down significantly. And then to make that even worse, they make plans for an election in 1653 upon the old franchise, which would essentially have produced a large Conservative majority, and the key point here being that in response would have slowed down the rate of reform even further, which really again antagonizes the army and sort of triggers the army and Cromwell in that instance to basically make a stand against them and basically dissolve the rump. And so the failure of that government can be attributed to their sort of lack, to their conservative nature and sort of lack of willingness to enact serious reforms. And then if we consider the next government which follows straight after that, again, you can blame the failure of that government on the nature of the MPs or the members of that assembly, which is basically, and so in this instance, they're discussing the nominated assembly. So Cromwell comes up with this idea, or adopts this idea, the nominated assembly, which gets referred to as the bare bones parliament. But as I mentioned again when I discussed it in the last lecture, the assembly continues, despite the kind of radical nature it supposedly has. In reality, most of its membership continue to be sort of from this kind of conservative gentry background. And so as a result, they oppose a lot of the radical reforms which the assembly tries to come up with. And so the assembly is eventually dissolved and fails, actually within the space of just 1 year, when the more radical members of the assembly attempt to pass a law abolishing church tithes. And so the conservative members, basically panicking and being quite opposed to this move and the implications it might have, basically conspire to meet early that year and dissolve the assembly and kind of give back their powers to Cromwell. So again, this second experiment in government, the nominated assembly, can be attributed in terms of its failure, or the failure of it can be attributed to the conservative nature of many of its MPs and its members rather. And then the third and final way, which you can argue that again, it's the conservative nature of those parliaments, is then when you again look at the continued hostile attitude these members adopt with Cromwell and the army in his next experiment, the instrument of government, or the First Protectorate Parliament. So the MPs in the First Protectorate Parliament essentially refuse to work with Cromwell once again, and antagonize him by basically refusing to vote in or allow him to pass his new constitution, which he refers to as the instrument of government. And so in voting it down, that swiftly ends up with Cromwell being forced to dissolve the parliament. And so you basically have the situation where they voted down because they're essentially mainly these quite resentful ex-members of the Rump Parliament who still were quite upset with Cromwell for dissolving the Rump Parliament in the way that he did. But it's also because there are largely a lot of MPs in that assembly who oppose the army's continued involvement in politics, both because of their radical nature, but also just in general, the whole principle of it. And so again, the nature of those MPs, in particular their more conservative nature, is what leads to the collapse of the instrument of government. And so these first three attempts at government, the Rump, the nominated assembly, and the First Protectorate Parliament, you can attribute the failure of them to the behaviour of the MPs within them, and in general, their kind of more conservative nature as well. So that's the first argument. The second argument, though, is that actually the group to blame here, very similar to the previous time period when I was doing the previous topic, is the role that the army plays. And so there's a couple of ways in which this point can be argued or made. So there's an argument that the continued involvement of the army in politics is what makes that government increasingly difficult. And that the demands of the army are quite a huge strain for two reasons. There's first of all the original problem from beforehand of the army being necessary to defend the country's interests, or the army constantly having to defend their own interests, and those being their interests in terms of being paid. The army demands payment and will not let anybody compromise on that issue. That's of course a problem because it means you have to basically tax people quite highly, etc. It just means they're quite difficult in terms of their demands. The second thing, though, whilst again I've mentioned how there is often this exaggeration over the extent to which the army is this harbour of radical ideas, they do still to a degree harbour those ideas, and they do have groups operating within the army who basically continue to promote certain kind of ideas. And so initially it's kind of groups like the Levellers, but then you also kind of have a fifth monarchist presence in the army as well. And so the army kind of tends to demand quite significant reforms and changes. Reforms and changes that so early governments are under undue pressure and strain to basically be enacting. So in particular, the Rump, for example, are under great pressure and strain by the army to enact these reforms while also having to deal with the very complex issue of governing in the first place. So Cromwell, for the first few years, is having to restrain the army to kind of be more patient with the Rump, and kind of give them more time. And so, of course, it's this pressure alongside Cromwell himself loses patience, which eventually leads to dissolution. And so it's the fault of the army who are impatient and kind of place this undue pressure and strain on the rump to basically reform at a very rapid pace. And reform quite a significant way as well. And then the follow-up point to that as well is the army, not only were they quite demanding, but they were also quite uncompromising in their demands and were often willing to remove and oppose anybody who was in charge who would not look after their interests or promote their agenda. And so, in many ways, Cromwell is really the only person the army is ever willing to work with or accept, and can, as a result, therefore contain them. So anybody kind of seeking to try and contain the army or kind of temper their demands, they are unwilling to accept at all. The only person who ever has any success in doing this is Cromwell. And so despite the fact that, despite his kind of own relative lack of radicalism, which I mentioned in the lecture when I discussed his personality traits, and I'll kind of elaborate on later on as well, this sort of shared experience in history that Cromwell had with the army gave him the authority to basically take some of the steps he did do. And basically kind of, again, sort of temper their demands and not sort of pursue such a radical agenda all the time. And so they occasionally threaten revolts against Cromwell, where he handles certain disputes on certain issues, but he always manages to kind of effectively sort of suppress them or deal with these issues or these crises when they sort of crop up. And so this issue of the army and what I say about Cromwell is kind of proven when you consider the final collapse of Republican rule. So when Oliver Cromwell dies, government, or rather the position of protector, passes to his son Richard Cromwell. And this problem of keeping the army in check comes to the fore immediately, as Cromwell is basically removed by the army in less than a year, or less than a year after becoming Lord Protector. And the reason being is the army basically see him as having been too close to the gentry or getting too close to the gentry and looking after their interests too much. Not that radically different to what his father did, but unlike his father, the army had little trust in Richard, and so the army forces him to step down. As I mentioned, they're very uncompromising in their views, and that plunges the country into chaos once more, and it leads to the eventual outbreak of conflict between the army and Parliament eventually. That leads to Monk coming from Scotland to basically put down the army and return Charles to the throne. So the eventual failure of Republican government can be attributed to the army's role in deposing Cromwell. Richard Cromwell, that is, not Oliver Cromwell. And so the army's role can be seen to have been problematic in this undue pressure on governments, in addition to their quite uncompromising position and willingness to remove them as well. So you have the army. But then linked to it, but also at the same time separate, you also have the role that Cromwell plays. And so you can argue that actually Cromwell uniquely as a figure was a problem in this time period. So Cromwell is undoubtedly, despite the importance of the army and Parliament, he is the dominant figure or the dominant political figure of the decade. And you can argue that in the short term, he is the one who often created instability with some of his decision making. And I'll kind of go into the reasons why that is in a moment. And so if we look at kind of the various decisions he makes, it's always kind of Cromwell's kind of very unsure of what he's doing and making decisions and taking decisions that essentially create instability. So it's Cromwell who is in charge at the time and takes the decision to dissolve various different parliaments and assemblies. So it's Cromwell who decides, okay, the rump are no good, they have to go. It's Cromwell who decides the first Protectorate Parliament are opposing him, they have to go, etc. So Cromwell is constantly chopping and changing between these different solutions and kind of never letting anything settle for a while and sort of bed in a little bit. He's kind of very impatient and sort of is always dissolving parliaments and physically creating instability himself in his decision making. But then you can also look at the actual decisions he makes with regards to particular forms of government that, again, are seen to be causes of instability. So one example is the introduction of the Major Generals that lasts from 55 to 56. And so this decision, for example, is highly unpopular and quite ill thought out as a solution, really. And so the kind of decision to impose military rule on people and also kind of task them with godly reformation of manners, whatever he calls it, it kind of leads to quite significant resentment of military interference in civilian administration to begin with. So it creates quite a lot of resentment amongst the local gentry in each of these different districts, but then also a lot of the heavy-handed nature of their government and sort of clamping down on social activities really makes them unpopular. And so this kind of idea of the Major Generals, and this introduction of them as a solution, wasn't a very good one to begin with. So again, we can blame it on Cromwell. And then you can, of course, also blame him for missing what was probably the best chance of creating stability that came about in 1657 by refusing to become king. So when the humble petition is offered to Cromwell and therefore offers to grant him the crown, he could have basically stabilized the protectorate. Since the offer basically came with a new constitution that would have established a limited form of monarchy. So it would have been a monarchy, but a kind of more controlled, limited form than it was under Charles. But Cromwell, kind of fearing the potential response of the army, basically bottles it and decides to reject the offer and instead take the title of Lord Protector as opposed to becoming king. And so this really golden opportunity to provide stability is one which he basically misses and kind of rather foolishly doesn't take. And so the first thing is the actual decisions he makes. What we can therefore link that to is also the long-term problem of Cromwell's vision. So similar to the situation with Charles, when we discussed in the last lecture about how Charles has these actions, but they're all linked to his mentality, Cromwell is the same. Cromwell arguably, even though I sort of controversially have quite a strong liking for Cromwell, especially compared to the fool Charles, the reality is Cromwell could arguably be seen to have some problematic personality traits when it came to government or ruling. And in particular, the main issue was that Cromwell had a vision that was fundamentally contradictory and problematic, and that's ultimately what doomed the Commonwealth as the person who was the dominant figure, who therefore pushed his vision. The problem was, and again we discussed this when we looked at Cromwell's personality, is that he was an unclear and unsure individual who could never commit to a solution. And as a result, he's pursuing aims that are contradictory and unresolvable except in his own mind. So if we go back to kind of Cromwell's personality traits which we discussed, Cromwell is fundamentally a conservative country gentleman who has the matching political beliefs. In other words, he doesn't really want to rock the boat too much. He actually believes in some kind of mixed monarchy. He wants some limits on it, but he also kind of does want to preserve social order and stability, like any other person from his background. But then at the same time, he has this other side to his personality, that of the Puritan religious radical, who at the same time tries to promote, to a fault, religious toleration in a way which basically infuriates the country. Because the problem is, unlike everybody else from his background, he doesn't seem to understand that religious toleration, in other words, letting different groups operate and exist, various different radical religious groups and sects, was a threat to social order and stability. So there's a couple of examples of cases where Cromwell personally intervenes, even when these guys really overstep the mark, because he had this soft spot for groups. So there's the famous case, the Naylor case, who was this Quaker man who basically did this sort of like Holy Sunday procession in Bristol, I believe it was. It was seen to be really controversial and quite shocking for the time, and the kind of ideas it's promoting, and kind of real breakdown of social stability. So he basically gets tried, and I think initially was going to get executed, or I think have his tongue bored through with a hot rod. And Cromwell basically intervenes to basically protect him. And the reason being is, Cromwell has this soft spot for radicals because even though he thinks their views are wrong, he believes it's kind of a harmless misguidance and that they're, at the end of the day, honest folk who are just trying to find their own way to God. And therefore, he never wants to clamp down on these groups. And so the problem is, though, the rest of the country sees these actions of kind of people like this Naylor chap as a real threat to social stability. That actually these radical groups, and I'm going to come back to it later, are a genuine threat. Cromwell does not see it this way, and so he pursues, as a result, policies that are irreconcilable in their kind of that are essentially irreconcilable. He tries, on the one hand, be this kind of conservative gentleman, kind of pursuing stability, but then on the other hand, he has this religious agenda that in many ways was incompatible, and so he pursues a vision that couldn't really be reconciled, and that was the main issue. And so Cromwell himself was, despite his many admirable traits, the wrong person to govern the country during this decade because he couldn't really commit to a particular vision. And that's why he kind of goes back and forth between these kind of different aims. On the flip side, though, again, if you want to do a counter-argument, which you could in this instance, you could at the same time argue that actually, and the only time you would do this is if you had a question saying Cromwell was to blame, the actions of Cromwell, which I've seen a couple of times. And what you can say as a counter is that actually, rather than being the problem, Cromwell was the only person who could have actually kept the republic going, and were it not for Cromwell, it would have collapsed sooner. And that he was actually the only guarantor of stability during this period. And I think there is actually a fair point to be made here. And the reason being is, it could be argued that Cromwell's actions helped to stabilize the Republican government. First of all, so there's two points. There's first of all, the crucial role he plays in neutralizing the domestic and external threats that were arising, in particular from the Scottish and the Irish. It is, of course, Cromwell who is dispatched to Ireland and neutralizes the Irish, of course, in a rather brutal way to begin with, but that's a rather minor challenge. The Scottish challenge and rebellion is a genuine threat. And as I mentioned, the crucial battle he wins to defeat the Scottish is seen to be one where it was essentially seen this miraculous victory, and largely in response to the quite the rather intelligent and effective strategy which Cromwell adopts. And so his actions in stabilizing the government in the early period by defeating these kind of external threats is seen to have been crucial. But then also, he as a figure is the only person who could have actually been at the head of the Republic during this time frame, in particular because of his uniquely placed position that allowed him to manage the constant issue of radical conservative tensions that become more acute after his death, with as you see with the removal of Cromwell. So I mentioned this point already, but again, this idea that actually there is this fundamental tension between conservative the conservative country or gentry and the radical army and other kind of various groups. And Cromwell had this kind of ability, because of his position with the army, to kind of adopt more conservative stances to kind of keep the gentry on board, but at the same time keep the army on board because of his position of authority with the army. And so actually, it's Cromwell who keeps the Republic going for so long. Without him, it actually collapses far sooner or a lot quicker and doesn't survive as long. And then the next kind of major argument you can make, or the final kind of major point you can make, is that actually the problem was the role that radical political and religious ideas played. And so actually, when you think about it, republicanism as an idea and the various groups that and promoted it was not a particularly clear idea, and that kind of various different type of Republican varied significantly. Many of them were actually quite moderate, sensible, conservative groups that had very practical aims, and again, weren't planning huge revolutionary changes with their kind of new government. The problem was, though, that the presence and influence of radical religious and political groups undermined republicanism and Republicans. There were a couple of reasons for this. The first thing is the actual demands and ideas that they brought alongside them. They often made republicanism an unrealistic aim and an unrealistic form of government, or an unrealistic political standpoint. So if, for example, we look at something more, the political groups, for example, the Levelers, that obviously had quite significant influence within the army in the sort of mid-1640s onwards. The demands they made, ideas of popular sovereignty, kind of extended suffrage, equality before the law, these are ideas that made Republican demands, as kind of by associating with them, far too radical for the very conservative 17th century social order. And so the aims were not particularly realistic given the involvement of groups like the Levelers. But then you also have even more so, some of the quite radical aims that were associated with republicanism due to the religious groups that were involved. For example, some of these quite prominent religious radicals that had positions in the army. So I've already discussed in previous lectures the fifth monarchists. So guys like this Colonel Harrison, who comes up with the idea of the nominated assembly, they end up being quite influential in the army. So these fifth monarchists, as I say, they're groups who believe in the kind of imminent return of Jesus Christ, and therefore that the world and kind of their aims were to basically prepare a form of government that would adequately prepare the country for his return, his imminent return. And so ideas they come up with, for example, the nominated assembly by Colonel Harrison, the whole point behind them was to basically try and prepare the country for the imminent return of Jesus. And so at best, the argument you can make here is that their aims were quite impractical for government. Whatever you think of them, or how sort of unrealistic they were. So that's the first side of things. They made Republican aims less realistic and kind of less practical. And then the second overall issue is this problem of the effect their influence had on public opinion at the time. And this is the really major problem when it comes to radical political and religious ideas. If this essay comes up and you discuss them, you really should discuss this point. And that is that, as I say, the behavior and spread of religious radicalism spooks the political nation and helped raise support for the return of monarchy. This is a really important point. As I've already mentioned, a lot of people felt that these radical political groups, but also the religious groups in particular, were a genuine threat to social order and stability. So I've already mentioned, for example, the demands of the Levelers, but then even worse was the proliferation of the various independent churches and sects. So you, for the first time, have a massive flourishing of various different independent churches. Previously, essentially, you only really worshipped in the main established Church of England. And so you get all sorts of quite radical and strange churches cropping up all over the place. And the kind of various different acts that are involved in the beliefs they have, again, they raise fears amongst the gentry of social breakdown. Now, these fears are probably actually kind of unfounded, but they raise genuine concern that actually there are some serious issues there are some serious social issues kind of at play across the country. And so it's Cromwell's pursuit of religious toleration that gave these groups space to flourish. So again, because Cromwell pursues religious toleration, these groups are able to operate more publicly for the first time. These groups had previously existed, but they were typically kind of hidden in secret. And so for the first time, a lot of ordinary people, a lot of sort of the gentry and the political elite are getting quite a good look at who these strange groups are, and they're not impressed at all. And so, so this kind of contributes to fears. And the thing is, it's the very simple act of worshipping outside of the church, or the kind of eccentric behaviors of some of these groups that the gentry believe are an implicit threat. It's just the idea of social breakdown. But then some groups as well, in addition to that, so for example, groups like the Quakers actually have overtly and explicitly provocative messages when it comes to kind of issues of social justice, social injustice rather. And so some of these groups, like the Quakers in particular, as I mentioned, actually seem to threaten genuine revolutionary activity potentially. And so what you find is that by the end of the period and throughout the period, you have an increasing clamoring for a return to monarchy, because that is seen to be the only way to guarantee and return some degree of social stability. And were it not sort of for this flourishing of radical sort of political and religious ideas, you perhaps wouldn't have seen such a desperate desire and wish to see a return to monarchical government. And that actually people weren't necessarily so keen on the idea. It was simply what had come about as an alternative that spooked people. So that's kind of sort of one of the arguments you can make. But then what you can then argue as a final point is that, leaving aside these sort of short-term issues that kind of crop up or who's kind of operating, you can actually make the argument that really Republican government was doomed to fail from the very beginning. That actually it was inevitable that it could not work. And the reason being is that from the start they had this fundamental problem of having to balance, or rather keep a very delicate balance of interests, or rather a solution to the very delicate balance of interests that they basically had to constantly juggle. And so Republican governments from the start face a fundamental problem of the need to gain public support and acceptance. So a government cannot function forever without genuine acceptance by the public and support. And so that was necessary. So in particular, the government needed the support of the gentry in the long term to function and remain stable. The problem was that at the beginning, the government was vulnerable. And so for as long as they were vulnerable, they needed the army to maintain security and order. The problem is that the army in turn requires quite high taxes, or rather requires wages, which in turn are sort of produced from raising taxes, keeping them quite high, at a time when the economy isn't doing particularly well. And the army also includes religious radicals, and their involvement in politics creates resentment. And so governments need to maintain this large army, which has these range of issues that alongside it create resentment from the gentry. So you have this sort of catch-22 situation where you need the army to survive and maintain stability in a sense, and kind of keep your position. But then for as long as the army exists and is their position, you can't really gain the support of the gentry in turn. And so, kind of to wrap up, there is often this kind of fundamental question of, could the Republic have ever worked? And there is an argument to it that perhaps someone like Cromwell could have made it work as that individual who could basically maintain these two interests. But ultimately, it kind of had to find a solution to a very delicate balance of interest that in the end was just too much to handle, and it was always going to inevitably succumb to that, to those pressures and those challenges, and kind of make way for monarchy to basically return. And I'll sort of leave it at that kind of final point. So again, I hope that was fairly useful and clear for the most part. Anything which, again, as I mentioned, which was unclear or perhaps needs to be clarified a little bit more, if you just sort of leave any questions in the comments section below, I will, as always, kind of endeavour to respond to them as soon as I can. Thank you for listening.